Today we're going to discuss a theme you've written about in your debut politics column for the new Statesman magazine this week, which all of our listeners should go out and buy. Do you want to lay out your thesis for us?
Yeah, basically I start by saying that you can tell from everything that Labour's doing at the moment, they're absolutely committed to winning, and that's overriding any sort of policy or moral concern. I think that's front and centre, and that's worth highlighting. And then I basically pose the question, if they're so focused on victory, does that mean they're going to sacrifice their left-wing credentials or their attempt to radically change government? And speaking to people this week, the insider riposte to this thesis is essentially, well, we are going to be radical because there are lots of things that we can do that don't cost lots of money. They point to planning reforms that would hopefully lead to more house building, education reforms, labour market reforms, the fact that they want to scrap zero-hour contracts, sector-wide bargaining. There's lots of things that you can do that don't necessarily require money. Look back at what the Wilson government did in the 60s with the legalisation of abortion, the legalisation of homosexuality, New Labour, devolution, the creation of the Supreme Court, the Human Rights Act. There's lots of things, often constitutional and social change, that can happen that don't involve massive spending. And then, as we've talked about many times, Anoosh, and I'm still convinced this is the most important thing in politics, Labour's fiscal rules are ambiguous at the moment. You have to basically scour Keir Starmer's speeches. You have to ring up Rachel Reeves' office multiple times to get any clarity, and it still doesn't really come. But what they've basically said, or what they seem to be saying, is that they're going to have the similar or the same fiscal rules on debt reduction as the government, or maybe even stricter. And then I basically say that this could be unsustainable once they get into office for two reasons. First of all, Labour is basically betting that they're going to have the return of economic growth before they spend more money. And I think that's it's
quite a big bet, that, isn't it?
It's quite a big bet. And then what's going to happen if they don't get the economic growth? I think there's going to be a rethinking there. Secondly, the government's fiscal rules are already set to be broken after the next election unless the Conservative government increase fuel duty, which they never do, and the ABR basically predicted their model on the fact that they will do, and then we sort of know that they won't. So there's no headroom at all. We already sort of know that the government's going to have to either raise taxes or increase borrowing or cut spending. That's your sort of fiscal trilemma that governments have to grapple with in the short term. So because of that, I think Labour inevitably will have to raise taxes or increase borrowing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because fiscal rules are kind of made to be broken, aren't they? It's very rare to have a government that sticks to their fiscal rules, but they are important politically. They can serve as a trap for the opposition or the government. And they are what's required to get the sort of, I think in your piece, you described it as a tick from the IFS. Is that right? Or someone
one
you
Labour
spoke
source
to?
basically said, we're really focused on getting the tick from the IFS on the manifesto.
So this is the Institute for Fiscal Studies. This is the place that everyone turns to work out whether or not our public finances are sustainable or not. And if they support Labour's manifesto as fully costed as they'd like to frame it, then that's something that they think could contribute to their fiscal credibility. So, it is important in a politicking sense. But I think once you get into government, you can fiddle around with those fiscal rules. Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak have done that. Yeah,
I think they've been changed 7 times in the past 13 years. I mean, New Labour didn't change their fiscal rules, I don't think, in 2009, post-financial crisis. And then Osborne and Cameron and all the successive prime ministers since then have changed them multiple times. So they are flexible. And I think there are some signs, as we've discussed before, within the fiscal rules that they're going to change them and predict or project public finances over a longer period, which lots of people are calling for, such as people like Andy Haldane, former chief economist at the Bank of England. People like that are basically saying that the fiscal rules that we've had for the past 15 years have been so constraining on public investment and public finances, and basically the way the government sees them is so short-term to predict or call for debt to fall over a 3-year or 5-year period rather than a 10-year or 15-year horizon. So, yeah, I do think it's likely that Labour will have to look again at their fiscal rules and their spending. They obviously do not want to talk about taxes at the moment. Obviously, they don't want to talk about many things. And one of the key responses to this argument is basically, is Labour lying to us then? Are they being dishonest? Are they going to do something different in government than they're currently saying? Well, yeah, maybe. Maybe that is one way to interpret it. And I do think it's an indictment of the way that political campaigns currently work in the UK. There isn't much openness and transparency about what different parties want to do. You don't really know their full prospectus until 6 weeks, 7 weeks before a general election when we get the full manifesto. Even then, manifestos are often extremely vague. Even then, governments often don't follow their manifestos in government, particularly if there's a crisis. There was no £70 billion furlough scheme in the Conservative manifesto in 2019, understandably, of course. But things change and governments act in a different way once they get into power. So, yeah, there's a huge amount of ambiguity. And I also think it's worth noting that just because Labour might be forced to increase taxes or increase spending, it doesn't mean that they're going to radically change the economic framework of the UK. Margaret Thatcher's probably still probably going to be the victor of the next election, whatever happens. The framework that she set up, I don't think we've got reason to believe is going to be upended in 2025. It just means that they might have to move away from some of the more austerity-focused language that I think has been coming out of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because you laid out the things that they've promised that are cheap or free. And I think that's something that people in Labour or on the policy side are really keen to do. Introduce things that don't cost very much money, but also could, create enduring changes in the way that this country is run. So institutional and regulatory changes. We discussed new labour, minimum wage, pension reforms, new employment rights. They were changes that weren't the most expensive funding commitments, but they were also enduring changes that weren't reversed by future governments. And I think that's something that Labour is quite keen on doing. Devolution is an example of that, relaxing planning you mentioned. And there's other ones as well, changing the emphasis in our curriculum, for example. And those things are less easy for governments in the future to reverse than say, OK, we're rolling out X number of Sure Start centres and then, a cutting government comes in afterwards and closes them down. So there's this sort of convenient bond between those things that don't necessarily require big funding commitments, but do actually have an ability to transform the way that the country is run. Not quite at a Thatcherite level, I don't think, but something that suggests that there's a new consensus when Labour comes in. So I think that's going to be the emphasis when we do see the manifesto.
Yeah, completely. And looking back to New Labour, I think it would be very strange to argue that what some of the change that they brought about was not radical. And I would agree that Tony Blair basically saw himself as the executor of Thatcher's will, as I've said before, and he stayed close to her wishes. But he also brought about huge constitutional change.
Yeah.
Huge constitutional change and huge social change as well. That in and of itself is radical. You can argue for or against it or not, whatever you want, but it's definitely radical. The other thing worth noting about New Labour is that they were able to massively increase public service funding without massively increasing taxes. That was a consequence of the fact that the economy was quite vigorous at that time, that something they inherited and then something they kept going until the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Labour won't have that luxury at all. So if they do want to spend more money, then it becomes a question of borrowing or taxes. In the short term, they'll say, well, we're going to have economic growth. Okay, well, let's see if that happens. But that's the sort of dilemma that they currently face.
And that's the dilemma within Labour in terms of its internal politics as well, because there's some people within the sort of higher-ups in Keir Starmer's team who are sort of ameliorating their language to the party's left. So someone said to me fairly recently that, once they get in, all bets are off. That's what they're telling some of the MPs on the left of the party, which basically means don't worry about all this austerity language. Once we get in, we'll do what we want. But then there's another side to it that I think I've heard more strongly recently, which is they're quite worried about when they get in because they're not going to be able to do massive changes to our public services. The NHS isn't going to feel that different, even if, as you suggest, they might be able to raise taxes here and there or do some more borrowing to put some more money into public services. It's not going to be felt that greatly because there's just not that much money around and they're in such a state. There's two sides of it. And I think the side that worries that people are going to feel betrayed once Labour gets in because there's not going to be this huge surge of optimism is sort of on the ascendant at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's also a key point, that the social atmosphere of the country at the moment is completely different to what it was in the 90s. I was speaking to someone in Starmer's office and they were basically saying that we're in an age of cynicism now, and that actually might play to Keir Starmer's strength. Naturally, that's what they would say, but it was one of the best defences of his more austere persona and lack of charisma that I've heard thus far. He's basically saying that Tony Blair's approach of idealism and optimism was fine in that sort of millennial fervour of 97, it's less applicable now, or less. It won't suffice. It won't pass muster in a nation that's absolutely kneecapped by inflation. People don't have the sense of hope about the future that sort of politics could play off. They need to be spoken to in a much more pragmatic way. There's the only way to build trust with the public and credibility is basically to demonstrate how you can deliver the things that you're promising. And also it's worth noting that's what Number 10's thinking at the moment as well. They're basically saying we have to deliver these 5 priorities, otherwise there's no chance of us having the credibility to outline a vision for the country 5 years down the line. I mean, as we've spoken about before, there is no conception of what the country will look like after the next election coming up. The Conservative Party right now, all of their focus is on the 5 priorities, which basically take them up to the end of the year. That's it, because they don't think that they've got even a chance of getting heard by the public until they deliver on those 5 priorities. So yeah, I mean, that age of cynicism also plays into it. And then I agree also about what you were saying about the dynamics within the party. The other thing worth noting on that is that when you get into government, the political focus suddenly shifts to the next election again. So whether or not Labour are going to be different in power, well, it might not be the case, because they'll just go straight to the next election. Okay, actually, we need to adopt this language or play down how much change you want to bring about in the economy because we need to win the next election. There's always another election, which goes back to the fact that British political campaigns aren't that good at having an honest debate about policy.
Yeah, I thought the age of cynicism point in your piece was the most interesting, actually, because like you say, it is a bit of spin because they're suggesting Keir Starmer is the man for this moment where people don't necessarily feel, you know, a swell of hope or aspiration because they're finding life so tough at the moment and they need a politician to meet them where they are. But it is interesting, isn't it? Because it perhaps suggests that his kind of politics is something that people are more likely to engage with at the moment. I remember when Phil Whitaker and I were interviewing Wes Streeting, he said to us in defence, I think we were saying the 5 missions were a bit vague or something like that. And he was saying, actually, Keir Starmer is not the kind of man who believes in speeches about big visions. He thinks that's really woolly. He's not the kind of person who wants to do that. I thought he was basically just defending his leader then. But it does strike me as something, since reading your piece, that is actually at the heart of the operation, which is thinking, actually, no, now it's not the time for a Blair-style swell of enthusiasm. It's time to explain sort of how we're going to manage things to make life a little bit better. But, you know, it's a risk because people always vote for the future. They want a bit of hope. I mean, I've sat in focus groups where people talk a lot about wanting luxuries back in life. They want to go on holiday again. I've written a piece about it this week. And, you know, people are naturally looking to something better. I think if it is just all doom and gloom, that might not necessarily be the most resonant thing. Yeah,
it's a balance, isn't it? And I think what we're going to see from Labour in the autumn is an attempt to move away from the doom and gloom and slightly towards the more optimistic setting out of what they want to do in government.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.